Right now, CJ Stroud is plus 1,000 and Jordan Love is plus 1,400 for MVP. So these are two quarterbacks that are already priced in as if they are going to be top passers at the NFL level, that they are going to be potentially top 3 in the NFL in both passing yards and passing touchdowns, which means you have to take shots on their receivers. Now, yes, they're very expensive. Yes, there are a lot of them. I'm going to try to figure out which ones you should be drafting, which ones you should be avoiding, and we're going to dive into everything here. Let's first start it off with the Houston guys, because the Houston names, you have 3 players going pretty much inside the top 40-ish picks of drafts at the moment. Starting off with the most expensive guy, Nico Collins. Full transparency, I ranked Collins after Stephon Diggs with our initial rankings that came out, I want to say a little over a month ago. And the more that we dive into these numbers, the more that I think it is a mistake. Since then, we saw the Houston Texans go out and they gave Nico Collins the bag. They gave Nico $52 million guaranteed, which I'm a little jelly, but nonetheless, we'll move on from that. And it somewhat makes sense because if you dive in deep from what we saw in Nico Collins' 2023 season, he was an elite level receiver. He averaged almost 15 fantasy points per game. He was at 86.5 receiving yards per game, 79 intended air yards per game, and 3.3 yards per route run. That 3.3 yards per route run mark was at the very top of the NFL. Pretty much the only other guy there was Tyreek Hill. He had a PFF grade at 91 at the very top of the NFL, pretty much as well at the wide receiver position. So it makes sense why a lot of people are in on Nico. I mean, this is a wide receiver that's also incredibly young, going to be 25 years old this next season. And if you're looking at the price tag of where he's going right now in drafts, he's the wide receiver 15 on Underdog. He's going right in the massive flat tier. I talk about this all the time. Obviously, this tier of round 2 wide receivers, they're all about the same. You can take them in whatever order that you want, but that tier is Brandon Ayuk, Chris Olave, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel, Nico Collins, Mike Evans, Jalen Waddle. You're going to see those guys go in whatever order in your draft. We don't really know right now, but we can say they are probably all going next to each other. Nico Collins is locked and loaded into being a second round selection this next season. Now, what's going to be interesting is if you look into Nico Collins' 24-age season and use the road of his screener to comp this out historically, other wide receivers that had similar age 24 seasons included Chris Godwin, Greg Jennings, Devonta Smith, Tyler Boyd, Jalen Waddle, Santana Moss, Allen Hurns, and Tank Dell we'll talk about in just one second. But the median projection that you had from these receivers going into their following age 25 year was about 14.5 fantasy points per game, which pretty much puts Nico Collins at a slight downgrade in comparison to what you saw a year ago. And I'm not going to sit here and act like it's a guarantee. Obviously, Nico has been on the upward trajectory so far through his NFL career. Why I was a little hesitant to rank him as the Houston Texans' number 1 receiver is if you go back to what you had in 2021, if you go back to what you had in 2022, he was bad. Like in 2021, yes, it's at the very beginning of his NFL career, but still 1.3 yards per route run. Yes, it's a horrendous offense. Yes, it's the beginning of his career, but really he was a wide receiver that didn't have a lot of pedigree and comes out and just blows up on the scene in 2023. So you don't have the track record, but you have such a high peak from what you had last season. He's supposed to be stepping into his prime. The Texans just gave him a massive contract that it's completely understandable why people are taking him in round 2 at the moment. And Stephon Diggs is a wide receiver that's falling. Now, I'm recording this video on June 7th. Now, yes, that's a little early. I'm about to be in France for an Ironman, so please excuse me on that. But what I've noticed is Stephon Diggs falling a considerable amount in these drafts. Right now, he has an ADP of wide receiver 18 at 27.4, but based off what I'm seeing in drafts at the moment, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Stephon Diggs falls behind DJ Moore, falls behind Malik Neighbors, falls behind Devonta Smith in ADP, and turns out to be a mid to late 3rd round pick alongside Tank Dell. Now, if you're looking at Diggs, it was really the tale of 2 seasons. Last year, you had with Ken Dorsey, and then after he was fired, right? I mean, Stephon Diggs in the second half of the season was a certified bum. But at the beginning of the year, the man was elite. It was all about the offensive coordinator change that he had in Buffalo. Obviously, Stephon Diggs came out and said, hey, I am not happy about that. I'm a wide receiver coming into my contract. I want to get paid again. About to be 30. I only really have one more shot. So the squeaky wheel gets the grease, whatever you want to call it. He gets sent over to Houston. he gets paired up with another elite level quarterback. But what's going to be very different in Houston in comparison to what he saw in Buffalo is you don't have the wide open depth chart. You have other names here that you're competing for targets with. If you're looking at Stefon Diggs over the past 3 years, he's been great. Over 2 yards per route run every season, over 100 intended air yards every year as well. But now he's going to be going into his age 31 year. This is about the time where it kind of makes sense to see a player trend down. If you're using the RotoViz screener to look at wide receivers that had similar age 30 seasons and what they did in their age 31 year, you had guys like Terrell Owens, Donald Driver, Joe Horn, Keenan McCardle, Troy Brown, Heinz Ward, Derek Mason, Calvin Johnson, Stefon Diggs, Julian Edelman. If you're looking at the median projection out of the guys that played, you were hovering at about 15.1 fantasy points per game, which was higher than what you had with Nico Collins. I want to point that out if we are comparing them one for one. What's very interesting for Stefon Diggs going into his age 31 season is he met with the Texans and said, no, I don't need a long-term deal. Let's go 1 year deal. Let me prove it. And then I'm going to get paid next offseason. So Diggs is betting on himself. We know that Diggs in the past multiple times now has been one that if he's not going to get the ball, he is going to get pissed. He is going to demand it. And he's almost going to get force-fed volume, whether it makes sense or not. So I understand a lot of people are off of Stefon Diggs for what happened in the second half of the year, but based off the extended sample that we have over the past 3 years, based off the historical comps where it still looks like Stefon Diggs projects out to be a high-end wide receiver 2 in fantasy, based off the fact that he's going over to a very efficient offense, I am completely fine drafting Stefon Diggs at his price point. If I'm looking at Diggs in comparison to DJ Moore, Malik Neighbors, Devonta Smith, I am personally hoping that Stefon Diggs falls behind all those guys. I'm hoping that the hate on Stefon Diggs continues and I'm able to soak him up as a high-end wide receiver 3 by the time the season gets here. Because on the flip side of this, Tank Dell is someone that is rising. Tank Dell is about to crack the top 24 receivers. At the time of this recording, as an ADP of 39, would not be surprised at all if this is the top 36 spots in ADP by the time this video is out. And this is a receiver that had a great year one. Now, there are some things with this Tank Dell profile that I didn't expect. So we have been doing just a ton of research for our draft guide that's going to come out this season. And one thing that I didn't expect is to see Tank Dell average 101 intended air yards per game this past year, which just illustrates that Dell's kind of getting involved in not the way I was expecting. I was expecting Tank Dell's involvement to be a little closer to the line of scrimmage, a little more inside. No, Tank Dell's running routes deep downfield. It's not like Tank Dell's soaking up volume just underneath. He's at 2.4 yards per route run, incredibly high PFF grade as well. He's almost at 13 fantasy points per contest last year. If you're going to look at his age 24 season last year and see what the historical comps are going into his age 25 season, you have guys like Chris Godwin, Devontae Adams, Amari Cooper, Tyler Boyd, Jalen Waddle, DK Metcalf, Santana Moss, Allen Hurns, Tank Dell, Nico Collins. If we're looking at the median projection here, you're looking at about 14.2 fantasy points per game, which is funny because this is right in line with what you have with Nico Collins. So I think a lot of people are going to come out and say, if Nico deserves a round 2 pick, so does Tank Dell. All these guys look to be valued neck and neck and neck. Like you can make an argument for any of them in a vacuum. So I think a lot of people, and you're seeing it with the trend right now with Tank Dell kind of getting all the steam. A lot of people are just going to go for the least expensive guy. They're just going to say, okay, all these guys could be great. Give me the guy that's going in round 4. I am not there. And I know this is weird. It probably makes sense to bet on the guy going into year 2. But if I'm looking at Tank Dell, I am hesitant for one reason in particular. It is going to be Tank Dell's size. Now, yes, Tank Dell overcame his size last season. Obviously, we all saw it. Tank Dell, I just said, had an amazing year. Tank Dell did get injured. I'm not saying it's because he weighs less than 165 pounds, but that may end up being a concern here. Because if we go back and look at receivers since the year 2000 that weighed fewer than 165 pounds, and look at the highest points per game finishers that you have, Tank Dell, by far and away, the best receiver the NFL has ever seen at this size. He had 16.5 fantasy points per game this past year, significantly better than the next few names. Afterwards, you had J.J. Nelson at 13.6. Then you had Taylor Gabriel in 2016 at 11.8. You had another finish by J.J. Nelson, Two other finishes by Taylor Gabriel. In 2023, El Tutu Atwell got you 8 fantasy points per game. Michael Lewis in 2003 got you 6.5. Taylor Gabriel yet again. JJ Nelson yet again. So what we have seen throughout pretty much all of the NFL is we have seen that these small guys cannot consistently go out there or at least have not up until this point. Tank Dell maybe breaks this trend. They cannot consistently come out here and be top 24 options in fantasy. Tank Dell is the only guy to do it. Typically what I am doing is if I have the opportunity, I'm going to go with the guy that has the much larger sample, that isn't looking to be an outlier based off the data over the past 24 seasons. So I personally will end up drafting a lot of Stephon Diggs in the middle of round 3, as opposed to Tank Dell in the middle of round 3, if that's where Dell ends up. If Tank Dell is going to mid to late round 4, I am willing to go out and draft Tank Dell at that point because I think Tank Dell has a ton of positives on his profile. But call me an idiot, and you 100% can. I am still going to be a little bit concerned for a wide receiver that weighs less than 165 pounds and what that potentially means for his fantasy football outlook and his longevity and maybe injury concerns that you'd have with him. Now let's go over to the Packers. The Packers will be a little bit of a different story because you have a million different names here. They're all a lot cheaper. I mean, right now on Underdog, the first Packers off the board at wide receiver 34 in Jaden Reed. So yeah, you don't even have to draft them as a wide receiver 1 or 2. And of course, if you wanted to draft Jaden Reed on Underdog, you can find that link in the description, comment section. Underdog's where I'm going to be drafting all year. It's where I drafted all last year, all the year before. I draft on Underdog Fantasy every single day on the live stream. And if you want to draft with us, you can find the link in the description or the comment section. Code FLOCK will get you hooked up with a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. Plus, you'll get our 2024 fantasy football rankings and our 2024 fantasy football draft guide with code FLOCK. Plus, you are going to be getting a special pick'em, something like Luka Doncic, more than less than half a total point. Depending on the day that you sign up will depend on the player. Underdog is available in damn near every state, and it's best ball. So that's how I draft hundreds of teams every offseason. How I won $150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. But let's go over and let's look at Jaden Reed. Now, Jaden Reed is a receiver that was the wide receiver 1 for the Packers last season. 11.5 fantasy points per game. He did so with 4 receptions per game, about 50 receiving yards per game. What was impressive was going to be the efficiency here, where you were looking at 2.2 yards per route run. Now you may say, well, Mason, come on, man. It's just because he was playing with Jordan Love, and Jordan Love was a stud last season. Well, look at the other Packers receivers here, because it's going to be very interesting to see their yards per route run in a bit. But yeah, I mean, beyond this, if you look at Jaden Reed, his age 23 year, to see who he historically comps to, you had Des Bryant, Terry McLaurin, Willie Snead, Deebo Samuel, Jerry Jeudy, Nate Burleson, Rashee Rice, Jaden Reed, Zay Flowers. The median projection for these guys going into their age 24 season was about like 12, 13 points per game. So definitely lower than the Houston guys that you had, but it is just interesting to give maybe a potential slight benefit over to Reed based off the efficiency that we saw in year 1, because I do think we may end up seeing more routes run from Jaden Reed going into year 2. Because if we go over and look at some of these other Packer receivers, now Christian Watson is someone that I was drafting last year. And what is so funny is we were drafting Christian Watson coming off a rookie season where he ran 2.6 yards per route run. Yeah, 10.3 fantasy points per game. I was sitting here going, okay, I'm pretty confident Christian Watson's a talented receiver. We want to be betting on talented receivers going into year 2. My only hesitation is we don't know exactly what to expect with Jordan Love. However, Jordan Love comes out here, smashes, exceeds all expectations, and Christian Watson still disappoints. So talk about taking the biggest L you could ever imagine. But going into 2024, we now know, Jordan Love's good. This is an offense that we're going to be betting on. The disappointing thing with Watson is obviously the continued injury history that we saw last year. Plus, you do see the efficiency fall off where he falls down to 1.8 yards per route run. And it is worth pointing out, if you are going back and looking at what you had from Christian Watson's 2022 season, a lot of these yards came from big plays. A lot of this came from, him just catching the ball, running an additional 60 yards for a touchdown. And that's why you saw him at the very top of the NFL with a lot of these metrics, including touchdown rate, but not get a ton of volume. And you know that typically efficiency is going to vary year to year, and what's going to be sticky will be volume. But Watson, wide receiver 46. The difficult thing is, I think if you're looking at wide receiver 46, I'm all in. But if you're comparing him to some running backs that you have here, it's like, okay, do I want Christian Watson or Ramondre Stevenson? And the thing is, in underdog drafts, I'm probably wanting to draft guys like Ramondre, Zamir White, DeAndre Swift in this range. Like, I'd probably rather be drafting running backs here. So personally, I haven't had a lot of Christian Watson this year. And really, I'm only taking him if I want to follow it up with Jordan Love in the following round. But going over to Romeo Doubs. Romeo Doubs, one of these names that looks like he may be just crowding up the wide receiver room a bit. And Romeo Doubs has scored touchdowns, right? So, I mean, that is a reason why maybe you want to go out there and you want to be a little bullish on him. He's been very inefficient. If you look at his PFF grade, it's been significantly worse than what you've had with these other receivers such as Jaden Reed and Christian Watson. If you look at his yards per out run, he's only been at 1.5 over the past 2 years. So Romeo Doubs has been getting used heavily, but he's been very inefficient with his usage so far. Going into year 3, I don't really see the high ceiling. The guys that he comped to historically, Deontay Johnson, Hollywood Brown, Michael Crabtree, Devontae Parker, Timothy Wright, Dante Moncrief, Mike Thomas, Ted Ginn, Zay Jones. And if you look at like the median projection that you have going into this next season, only at about like 7.5 fantasy points per game. So I'm really never going to be drafting Romeo Doubs this year, at least in this range. I would much prefer getting Devin Singletary, Brian Robinson, Trey Benson, or Javonte Williams. Like, give me one of the running backs in this range of the draft. And if I am going to go for a discounts Green Bay Packer, it'll be Dontavian Wicks, who's only 22 years old this past year. Dontavian Wicks didn't have a ton of volume, obviously, but this is a receiver that came out and did a decent amount with his volume. I mean, he has 2.2 yards per route run. His PFF grade up at 78.4, so obviously significantly higher than what we saw with Romeo Doubs. And you are getting a little bit of a discount on him where he's going at wide receiver 60. And the running backs in this range are just a completely different class, right? Instead of you having to pass on Javonte Williams, you're having to pass on Ezekiel Elliott. So I think the opportunity cost to take Dontavian Wicks is a lot lower than what it would be to take Romeo Doubs. So between these two guys, give me Wicks over Doubs, especially at wide receiver 60. And I think maybe with a little bit of a wider range of outcomes. Now, one last offense I forgot that we were going to talk about here is going to be the Kansas City Chiefs. And Hollywood Brown is a wide receiver that has been getting steamed up. Xavier Worthy dealing with this minor injury, yada, yada, yada. I understand why people are in on Hollywood Brown. This is a wide receiver that gets the contract to go to Kansas City, playing with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, if not the best quarterback in the NFL. And all of a sudden, you want to combine his speed with Mahomes and say, oh, big spike week potential. This is someone in underdog drafts that can completely win you a tournament. If you dive into the numbers for Hollywood Brown here, he has been a train wreck. Goes from 11.3 fantasy points per game down to 10.2, down to 7.8. Goes from 105 intended air yards per game to 110 down to 90. Goes from 1.7 yards per route run down to 1.6, down to 1.3. Goes from a PFF grade of 68, 69 down to 67. Bad all 3 years. So if you're looking at Hollywood, this is a wide receiver that's consistently gotten worse for 3 years now. Yes, finds himself in the best situation that he's had in his entire NFL career. But what's very interesting is if you look at the contract that the Chiefs gave this guy, $6.5 million guaranteed. That's less than Aaron Jones. He's getting paid running back numbers at the wide receiver position, which, I mean, maybe you say, oh, Mason Aaron Jones is about the same as. To get paid this little at receiver is going to be really concerning. If you look at the RotoViz screener here, if you're looking at the expected range of outcomes, you had guys like Emmanuel Sanders, Plaxico Burress, Lee Evans, Kevin Dyson, Kevin Johnson, Rod Gardner, Marquise Lee. Really, the expected range of outcomes that you would have historically here for Hollywood is like 9-10 points per game the following year. Going over to Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice, really interesting usage last year, where his intended air yards per game only at 31. So you're seeing that Rice is really only getting used close to the line of scrimmage. I mean, this is not someone that's operating deep downfield, kind of just as a gadgety type receiver. Now, with that being said, he was very efficient in this role where he is sitting at 2.5 yards per route run, really high PFF grade at 85. If you look at what you had from Rice in comparison to all 23-year-old wide receivers since the year 2000, He comps to like Jerry Jeudy, Nate Burleson, Willie Snead, Dwayne Bowe, Terry McLaurin, Des Bryant, with an expected median range of outcome of like 12.5 to 14.5 points per game. So if you're looking at this price at wide receiver 47, obviously it makes no sense for what he gave you this past year. It's all going to be down to the suspension. So if you're in like a regular home draft where you're having to submit your starting lineup from a week-to-week perspective, I'm going to ignore Rashee Rice. I don't necessarily think it makes sense to go out there and significantly invest into him. However, if you're in an underdog tournament where you are just heavily incentivized to build for weeks 15, 16, 17, where we are trying to come up with the highest ceiling that we can there so you can try to turn like $25 into $1.5 million in Best Ball Mania, there, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to take Rashee Rice because we've seen time and time again that the NFL just kind of wants to have its best players on the field and isn't going to be super tough with suspensions unless it is horrible press. And I think they're going to be able to sweep the Rice stuff under the rug. I think he does get suspended, but I don't think it's a season-long one. And going over to Xavier Worthy, I really like the prospect. I think he's a reasonable price right now in underdog drafts. I mean, this is someone that dominated over A.D. Mitchell this past year at Texas, 1,000 receiving yards versus 845 for Mitchell. This is a wide receiver that breaks out right away at Texas. As a true freshman, he has 12 touchdowns through 12 games played. So you have an early breakout. You have the top end production, his final season. You have the round 1 NFL draft capital. I think you have way more upside taking Xavier Worthy than you have taken Hollywood Brown. You have to take Hollywood round 5 and you get Worthy round 6. So I'd rather just take the cheaper guy here. But I think that's all I have for y'all. Again, if you enjoyed it, please go down there, hit that like button, subscribe if you play fantasy football. And if you want to hop in and draft with us, of course, you can do so on Underdog Fantasy. It's we're going to be drafting all year long. It's where we always draft. And yeah, if you use code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. Plus, you'll get our 2024 fantasy football rankings and draft guide. Plus, you will get set up with a special pick'em, something like Luka Doncic, more than less than half a total point dependent on the day that you sign up. But thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day and really hope we get to see you out with the video later in the week.